afternoon, everyone. Hi. Okay, just before I start, I just want to get a little bit of clarity around the term intercultural, because that's a word that's branded around an awful lot, and people don't always know or understand what it means, or people use it without thinking exactly what it means. So very often people talk about cultural awareness, which just means really knowing about another culture, and that might be things that you can see. However, it might be values and ways of life and daily practices, etc. as well. Also, we have the term multicultural, which tends to refer to coexistence of different cultures next to one another, but doesn't necessarily refer to dialogue between different cultures and looking at understanding one another from one another's perspectives, where we decenter and we don't just look at it from our perspective, but we try and get into, as far as possible, the skin and the thinking and the mindset of the other culture. And that requires all different kinds of skills and all different kinds of knowledge, okay? And I'm going to talk about skills and knowledge in a moment. The barriers that I'm going to talk about should become apparent quite soon. But I'm thinking about young people who don't necessarily have chances or opportunities, either through their daily lives and the circumstances they find themselves in their communities or with their families, or through their education specifically for intercultural dialogue. And the other thing that I just want to get straight before we start is that we need to think about foreign language learning and what really is the purpose of foreign language learning. Yeah? So it used to be something that was kind of for an academic elite. It was almost an aesthetic study. It was studied like the arts. It was studied for the grand tour if you were part of the upper classes. Okay? Then we move into an era where foreign travel becomes more open to wider communities. However, we're still kind of in the tourist mode and seeing things from the outside. And we're looking maybe at transactional language for a shorter period abroad. But when communities and people are in full flow, the way they are today, people need skills to engage interculturally so that we have harmonious relationships with one another, okay? And it's thinking about foreign language learning for that purpose. So just to have a look at how that's happened in foreign language learning, I've really pretty much given you that pictures. The only thing that I didn't talk about was the 60s and 70s. So there we're in the post-World War II era, and we're thinking about peacekeeping, we're thinking of, from the UN's point of view, and we're also thinking about the beginning of multicultural societies. So that's the kind of time when it starts, okay? I've talked about the 80s and the 90s. The only thing that I didn't mention when I talked about the intercultural was that this is also a critique of thinking of culture bilaterally, i.e. the French do this, the Germans do this, the Swiss do this. Well, actually it's not like that, because cultures are now much more complex and people have identities which are, are merged in all kinds of different ways. So we need to think about that, okay? And we get into cultural understanding in lots of national curricula. We get it in particular in language learning for the reasons that I just explained. But the problem is that there's a lack of guidance and details in how do teachers actually go about that pedagogy? How do you make that happen? And also within foreign language learning, there's still a tendency to focus on this approach, which actually separates out language learning and cultural learning. So you might do the cultural learning in the mother tongue, but do the language learning to develop linguistic skills on its own. And there's been a real challenge, especially for younger learners who aren't able to engage with more sophisticated texts or films or media because the language level is quite high, to get that language and cultural learning going on together. So that's a bit of background, okay? So why online exchange? Online exchange is sometimes referred to as telecollaboration, okay? And basically we've got a definition there from Dooley, which I'll just let you read. It's fairly straightforward, okay? And Thorne talks about telecollaboration as being basically a turning point. We've got a huge vehicle here for the intercultural turn, because people that wouldn't necessarily have communicated with one another face-to-face interculturally can now do so vis-a-vis the internet. Okay, this is the theoretical bit, which I'll try and do as simply as possible. There are many frameworks for intercultural competence or understanding. And the one that I'm going to use is Michael Byram's framework from '97, and I'm going to try and get through this quite quickly and as simply as possible. Normally we think about cultural awareness as having knowledge. We know about other cultures, okay? So we might know things in terms of the way they act, the way they dress, the way they eat, okay? But what Byram's talking about is not just knowledge about other cultures, but knowledge about self. Why do we have the culture that we have? Where does it come from? Why do we tick the way we tick? Okay? And then more importantly, he goes on to talk about skills. So I'm just going to do the headlines. So it's in French, and it was written for the Council of Europe, hence the reason why it was in French. But I think also those of you who are linguists, the verb savoir works very well with another infinitive. So we've got this to know, to do something, okay? So we've got interpreting and relating, okay? And that's really important. We've got discovery and interaction, so these are skills. And then we've got intercultural attitudes. And I'm going to refer to these three, and I'll show you how in a moment. I'm not going to refer to this one, so we're going to park that one for the moment. Okay. Why did I want to get into this project? Well, actually, it's a follow-up project from my PhD, which I finished a couple of years ago. And what I found, and this is published in articles that I co-wrote with my supervisor, was that intercultural understanding is constrained for children from less privileged socioeconomic backgrounds. Okay. Also, if the student was from a poorer family, they have not necessarily less opportunities from the school, but they did not travel abroad on the school study trip as much. And there are all kinds of issues related to a face-to-face exchange, so we used to hear about the school exchange because of concerns about litigation, child protection, etc. And teachers are basically very, very rarely taking children on school exchanges abroad, okay? Most of these projects, most of the research here has been done in higher education with older students, okay? So the thinking behind this was a virtual exchange might be a vehicle for transcending these kind of barriers that we're facing. So these are the research questions that I was interested in. Can this type of exchange facilitate intercultural learning? What kind, okay? How may this actually enable young people who wouldn't necessarily have this opportunity to do so? What were the limitations and opportunities, and basically what can we learn from the project? So I'm talking to you about an action research project, okay? Kind of things that have come up in the literature, why it's good for intercultural understanding. If people communicate with one another on a personal level, and the kind of things that they tell each other allows for a much more personalised view of culture, and it's not something written in a textbook, the French do this, the Germans do this, etc. So people are talking about their own lives. And because very often it's asynchronous, i.e. there's a pause between the communication, sometimes it happens in sync, basically it's a sort of chat facility or Skyping, then there's time for reflection. So you can think about, reflect with your peers, with your teacher, about what people are saying about their own cultures. And we can develop all the kind of skills and attitudes that we were talking about on the previous slide. But sometimes if people are discussing contentious issues, it might not necessarily be sorted out. So for example, one project, Spanish and US students were talking about the war in Iraq, and that ended up in complete cultural clash and actually led to misunderstanding. And if young people are not, or adults are not interculturally competent, actually this worsens things, okay? Then there are all kinds of structural and logistical challenges regarding timetables, assessments, what kind of curriculum objectives there are. And you might think that the teacher's role is less here, because if young people are basically communicating with one another online, what does the teacher need to do? Hey, we have to be careful here, because actually the teacher needs to model and coach how to prepare material for one's partners, and they also have to show them the kind of things that people would be interested in, and that's the resource, and also actually understand the kind of things that they find out about within a wider cultural context. Okay, so as I said, it was an action research approach, and it was mostly qualitative data, and the data was collected from the website interactions. I went in and did some lesson observations. I'll tell you how it was set up in just a moment. An interview with the teacher and various things here. Because I couldn't, and I'm going to tell you about an exchange that we did with a school in Germany and a local school here, okay? Because I didn't have funding or time to go to Germany, the focus is on the English experience. However, the website also allows me to access the German children's posts. The framework I showed you was used to investigate research question 1, but there was a more inductive approach for the other things. So, we've got a local school in Merseyside on the left. You see a little bit about their profile here, who were partnered with a class in Germany. And the way it came about was because I'm in teacher education, we have links with local schools. And a mentor who I'd worked with really well in a local school had a class that he thought he might like to try out this project with. So I suggested to him about this. So I had a discussion with him and said, would we like to do this? He said yes. He chose his class, and he also had contact with a teacher in Germany who happened to be in the twin town. And the reason why we matched these two groups of students, even though there was a slight age difference, is because the Germans are actually much better at communicating in English. Oh my goodness, I've got 5 minutes, I've got to hurry up. Okay, they communicated with one another in their mother tongue. However, they then had access to the foreign language from the posts that they received from one another. Does that make sense? So they did the reading and the listening in the foreign language, but they did the speaking and the writing in the home language. Okay, so this was me organising it with the other teacher. We had initial getting to know one another questionnaires where they asked each other all about themselves, and then that was followed up. And they worked in groups as partners rather than one partner with another partner. So a group devised a questionnaire for another group, who then answered the questions as a group. So then the thinking behind that was they had to think about what kind of things they might want to tell each other about their holiday, about themselves. The German children went to Oxford and reported on a trip about there. The English children did not, so they just reported on their half term. And then they asked each other about school life in questionnaires, and they created videos to respond to those questions. Okay? We did want to use social media because we thought that would be a nice way to do it, but we ran into problems because actually there are age restrictions for children under 13. And we couldn't use Ning as originally intended, and we had to use this thing called EduBlogs, which was a bit clunky and wasn't really ideal to be refined. Okay, so what kind of things happened there? Well, they were definitely trying to find out about one another. That was really clear. So they were interacting with one another and discovering things about one another, but their interests tend to be very much the same. So they were interested in films and shopping and social networking and computer games, etc. So really the opportunities to do the interpreting and relating were at a fairly superficial level. And here's a quote from one of the children. There are not big differences, but little ones, there's nothing you'd be dead shocked about. Okay? But you could say, well, actually, what we're finding out here is that for young people, culture is culture is just far too abstract. And the way they see culture is something that's much more visible and relates to their everyday lives. Okay? They did get on with one another, that was really clear, and we could see some friendships. So they were actually developing intercultural attitudes, and it would seem that the stereotypes they might have had of one another were dispelled. Okay? When they wrote trips about their holidays, unfortunately the trips about Oxford were rather boring. They said, we went to the zoo, we visited the castle, then we went to University College, we went to McDonald's, and then we went home to our families. And you think, oh my gosh, well, okay, so they are 11 or 12 years of age, but they could have said, because they were writing their own language, I was expecting Oxford to be, I found the English this, that, the other, I had such and such for breakfast, they were staying in families. That wasn't really what I liked and what I normally eat for my breakfast. Or there were all kinds of things that they could have talked about, which was a little bit disappointing. So we tried to get the English children to ask them questions, and these are the kind of questions that we got, which were really interesting. And then we got this kind of response here that I'm pointing to. And that actually developed these skills of interpreting and relating much further. But that made us realise, actually, the teacher had to do much more coaching and modelling about the kind of things the children needed to write. So if they'd received appropriate support, that would have been better. And here we see a common pitfall of the online exchange, that so much time is spent on logistics and not necessarily on the pedagogy and the teacher preparation. Okay, videos were brilliant. They got lots of really interesting questions for one another, and the language in the questions actually said something about school life. I'm not going to go into German details now, but there were actual linguistic terms that were culturally representative of school life in Germany. The children were really curious to see what it was like in Germany. And I really like this comment. I used to think that the Germans were dead like harsh. I was with the German on holiday, and he